I am Kevin Barrett, blowing the whistle on crimes of the powerful since 2006. Please subscribe to the show. Go to truthjihad.com and click on the Subscribe at Substack button. Welcome back. This is the second hour of tonight's Truth Jihad Radio. I'm Kevin Barrett, and I guess I'm a follower of Jesus. I practice the religion of Islam, but we Muslims are actually followers of Jesus, the prophet who's mentioned many, many times in Quran. Turns out that both my radio guests tonight are also followers of Jesus. I hadn't really realized Richard Cook was, but we just learned that he is, and now we're coming on with yet another follower of Jesus. I guess we're all followers of Jesus here on this buzz. Tom Compton. Tom is he's a follower of Jesus who has done some educational efforts around the issue of Christian Zionism. So let's talk about that and more. Welcome, Tom Compton. How are you?
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I have been a big fan of yours for a number of years and supporter. And I like to think of your work as thinking man's fuel, actually, for thinking men and women, I should say, to be politically correct nowadays.
Well, we do have some female listeners and radio guests here. And Kat McGuire is doing more than just about any of the men I know to wake people up these days, for example.
Oh, I loved your last interview. I've listened to several interviews with her. So, yeah, and I love the divergence of people. My little corner of the world is with an organization called We Hold These Truths that was started in 1996 by my longtime friend, Chuck Carlson. And he's a fellow follower of Christ and an activist. He spoke out against the Federal Reserve System back in the 70s. He gave talks on it. We did all kinds of activist things. I've known him for over 35 years. And so our group was founded in 1996, but prior to that, kind of interesting, I wanted to kind of give you a little background. First of all, I like to say I'm a follower of Christ, or Jesus, not a Christian, because there's so much baggage with certain Christians. A lot of Christians that give Christianity a bad name, if you get the drift here, and we'll talk about some of those. And maybe we can start off with one of the most odious is a guy named John Hagee with Cornerstone Church in San Antonio. He heads up a group called Christians United for Israel. And it is supposedly the largest Christian Zionist organization in the country. They claim 8 million followers. I'm actually on their list, so I guess I'm there as a observer to all the lunacy that goes on with that organization. And our little group we'll talk about here has actually challenged John Hagee and his group on a number of occasions. We've started what are called vigils, but backing up in 1990, before the first war on Iraq, the first Gulf War, Chuck Carlson was a deacon in a Southern Baptist church. And this was before any of us understood the concept of Christian Zionism or Zionist Christianity. But what Chuck had done, he wrote a letter this was in December of 1990, just about a month before we attacked Iraq, and he was urging his fellow leaders of the church against going to war. Well, it fell on deaf ears, as we can all well imagine. But in 1994, he wrote an article for a national magazine. It was entitled "Attacking Islam." With the fall of communism in the late 80s, early 90s, we were without an enemy. And of course, the enemy du jour has become Muslims. And so he understood this very well. And in 1996, he and a few of followers of Christ started We Hold These Truths. And we've been at it now for over 25 years, and we're just a small group. But one of the things that he started out with, which was kind of interesting, it was the attack on Sudan, which was primarily a Muslim country, and it, of course, has split into two, South Sudan. They've had a civil war going there for 30-some years, but
and of course that was a resource grab, as far as I can tell. That is the Israelis were very much involved in it, splitting off South Sudan from the rest of Sudan and grabbing up the very rich mineral and other resources from South Sudan. I think that was part of the 7 countries in 5 years strategy that was behind 9/11.
I would agree. And the interesting thing, recall after the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, Bill Clinton orchestrated a bombing raid on a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, saying that they were making precursors for weapons of mass destruction. Where have we heard that before? But it turns out that, there were no weapons of mass. It was a pharmaceutical. And the Sudanese were trading oil with the Iraqis. And, of course, we know what happened. Over 500,000 children died during the 90s because of our embargoes, continued bombing there by the United States. And so it was a real catastrophe. But the other interesting thing that...
and then before you move on from that, let's just remind listeners that John Perkins in Confessions of an Economic Hitman pointed out that the economic and other hitmen, the kind of people he worked for at the World Bank, IMF, and then the USG agencies, basically made Saddam Hussein an offer that he wasn't supposed to be able to refuse. He was supposed to do the same deal in oil for dollars that the Saudis were doing, and he didn't. He refused. He didn't want to sell out his own people. He wanted to use oil money to build up Iraq, and so that was the reason that he became the enemy, even though he had gotten his start in life as a CIA hitman, and he'd been very much involved with the Anglo-Zionist empire, but then he wouldn't cut that deal, and so he became the enemy.
Well, that's exactly. I mean, that's just a repeat of what's happened so many times with the U.S. and we're all deceived. I can go think back in the 70s when Chile, when Pinochet came into power, Salvador Allende was overthrown. And at the time, I thought, he was a communist, and wasn't it great? And then, of course, I found out later that it was an orchestrated coup. Henry Kissinger was behind it. And, it's like we've done in so many places in Iran and so forth. But the interesting thing, getting back to Sudan as a side thing from a Christian standpoint, it was the big thing in the late 90s was freeing slaves in Sudan. And this was really big business for Christian churches. In fact, one of our members, for $35, you could free a slave there in Sudan. Never mind that a goat cost more. But, it was a catch and release program, and a lot of churches fell into this. And in fact, there was I think he was actually a elder of D. James Kennedy Church, Coral Ridge Ministries in Florida, that had contacted Chuck, and so he had the inside information. Well, they started a campaign to free the slaves, and it turns out it was one of their biggest moneymakers because everybody wants to help and feel good about doing such a noble deed. Well, that's one of the things that Christians can bite into. And so,
interestingly, for Muslims back in the days of slavery, which was up until 200 years ago, everywhere in the world, pretty much, for Muslims, it's always been a very good deed to free a slave. Freeing your slaves is the best thing you can do.
Well, I agree, and so we could smell a rat a mile away. particularly with all this demonization of Muslims and Muslim countries. It was really an orchestrated, act that was going on. And
so the subtext was the Muslims were the slaveholders and the Christians were the slaves. That was their message.
Yeah, well, exactly. They were freeing the Christian slaves. Well, there are some Christians in southern Sudan. The animist religion, I think, was more common down there. And there were missionaries that made, really good money out of this activity. It was, like I said, it was a catch and release program. And we detail that in our website, WHTT.org. It's got a wealth of information. We've had the website now for over 20 years. And so we've accumulated a lot of things, but kind of moving in forward, Chuck Carlson in 2002 took a trip into Israel, and he went into Gaza. This was in March of 2002. He had a contact with the Southern Baptist missionary there. He went in, spent, about 5 days there. He actually stayed in a building owned by the Southern Baptist Convention that they were selling. They were pulling out. And he even visited a Baptist church on Omar Nakhtar Boulevard. It was the old mosque, and the new mosque was right next to it, and they were living peacefully. And the remarkable thing, he got to speak to some college students, and he did, spoke and investigated. I loaned him my video camera, and one night he heard all this commotion, went up into the roof, and there were Apache helicopters shooting Hellfire missiles, I guess. And during that raid, 4 Palestinians were killed and 40 were injured. And the next day, he actually filmed part of the funeral procession there. And so at the time, the only way people would learn about something like that is when he came back and told them, because the media was all. We do get some, there's been more coverage of late in the wars in 2008-9 and particularly in the 2014 wars and so forth. So that kind of set us on a course to, back at the time then, they didn't call it Christian Zionism, and we ought to define for people what is meant by Zionist Christianity. And from our website, Zionist Christianity is the belief that the present-day political state of Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And we contend instead it is a secular state like our own USA and has assumed a semi-God status in the minds of many of the 50 million or more professing American evangelical and mainline Christians. Not so many mainline Christians, but it is it's quite amazing. And any of your listeners that has occasion to talk to a Christian, they can do the little litmus test. They can ask this person, and they won't be offended at all. And by their reaction, you can sort of tell. But you ask them the question: do you believe that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy? And if they say yes, 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 and they're starting to levitate off the floor, well, your conversation is probably going to end right there, because nothing you say will dissuade them, from changing their minds. It's a very difficult a task to do, actually.
Wouldn't you say that's a kind of idolatry to be worshiping the state of Israel like that?
It is, but it's so wrapped in the theology. I want to tell just a little story. My dear wife passed away just 5 years ago on November 1st, 2016. And she was a follower of Jesus. She taught women's Bible studies. And, she became a follower of Christ in her later 20s. And she actually quit a high-paying job, went to a Bible college for a couple years, came back, and then she really lived for the Lord. And we were married in 1991 and live here in the Phoenix area. And she taught these courses, and one of the courses that she taught was an outfit called Precepts Ministries, and they're out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, run by a woman, Kay Arthur. And when she passed away, there were 50 of the binders. I had no idea. She was very diligent in all these. These were big, thick binders that she had for these courses that she had taught. Plus, there was another 25. But it turns out that Kay Arthur is a dyed-in-the-wool Christian Zionist. She would literally die for Israel. In fact, I have a memorial for my wife, and if anybody is interested, they can go to our website, WHTT.org, and put in the search engine Linda Compton. And it goes into depth. And one of the examples we give of these hateful Christians, Kay Arthur, this is in 2014, and Anne Graham Lotz, the daughter of Billy Graham, the famed evangelist, are in Jerusalem. And it's a little video. We play the audio portion of it, but they're urging people to come on their tour to Israel. This is during Operation Protective Edge, I think, but that was the 2014 one, where over 500 Palestinian children were murdered, something like over 2,000. Most of those, 75% or more, were civilians. And anyway, they're urging people to come because the Israeli government has said it's perfectly safe. And, all we could say is, what callousness. It just goes beyond pale that Christians are so idolatrous. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is an idolatry, and it's very difficult to come out. But my wife had been studying what we had been doing since the early 2000s, and so she had a very much a sympathy for the Palestinians and the issue, but her theology was what was known as dispensationalism, and we won't get into that. I mean, it's a wide spectrum of beliefs particularly about end times, but at the extreme end, it is this Christian Zionist belief that Israel can do nothing wrong, and whatever they do, God gave the land. I mean, she makes clear, this Kay Arthur, in another video, that God gave the land to the Jews, and in essence, the Palestinians have no right to live there. And so, but what was remarkable to me is that my wife told me, this is several years before she passed, that she would no longer teach these precept ministry courses. She developed her own courses, which took even more work and dedication. So that's how deep this belief can be. So it's very difficult to get people to come out of it. I never considered myself a Christian Zionist, or even, I always thought of Israel as the Marxist showplace in the Middle East. And, I really didn't think about anything about the Palestinians, what was happening, until Chuck went on this tour into Gaza. And then what happened in 2002, in October, in the build-up to go to war for the second time against Iraq, there was a man named Richard Land. He was the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And they are very dispensational, and a lot of them are Christian Zionist in theology. But anyway, he wrote a letter that was addressed to George Bush, and it was signed by Chuck Carlson of Prison Fellowship. He was one of the guys in the Nixon administration, went to jail, and he became a Christian. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Christian Zionist. Bill Bright of Campus Crusade, and this E.J. Kennedy from Coral Ridge Ministries. The letter said to George Bush that going to war in Iraq would be a just war. according to their interpretation of the Bible. Well, Chuck Carlson and even me understood that was a load of hogwash. That violates everything that Jesus taught. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. He said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And so when we see people like this flaunting and ignoring what Jesus has taught us, then you have to wonder. Well, we did something so remarkable, Kevin, I think, in November. This letter came out in October. And Chuck, at the time, I didn't realize what was happening. Chuck was our key guy, and he did all the investigation. But anyway, he started what we call vigils. And the first vigil was conducted in Scottsdale, Arizona, at a Southern Baptist church here in Scottsdale. And I didn't realize this till years later why he picked it, because of this Richard Land letter. And we would hold signs up like, choose life, not war.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're doing is sort of the Christian version of what Henry Herskovitz has been doing in Ann Arbor, picketing in front of that Beth Israel synagogue that is also pro-Zionist. Maybe you guys should get together.
I can say, amen. And speaking of Henry, Chuck Carlson has gone to Ann Arbor and stood with Henry Herskovitz in front of that synagogue that he's been going to for 16 or 18 years now. It's quite remarkable. In fact, our vigils, we've done 2 vigils at synagogues with Jewish Voice for Peace. We would never go in front of a synagogue, as Christians, but we had Jewish Voice for Peace. This was out in San Francisco, and they really were wonderful assets because they just lit into people coming in. It was quite something. But it's I just lost my train of thought there, Kevin. It's quite remarkable how all this works. But going back to our vigils, we conducted probably around 200 of these vigils over the years, and including at John Hagee's Christians United for Israel, their second annual meeting in Washington, D.C. This was in 2007. And some of our signs are "No More Wars for Israel." Imagine that. Blessed are the peacemakers. Getting back to this choose life, not war, one of Henry Herskovitz signs, we haven't used it, is the victims have become the victimizers, in front of the synagogue. But the concept of choose life, not war, I think was brilliantly picked because most evangelicals will tell you that they're solidly anti-abortion, but they're pro-American, they're pro-war. So they support these wars that kill people. And we know the millions of people in the last 30 years that our serial wars have committed in the Middle East for Israel. These are wars, in our sign, "No More Wars for Israel" is so appropriate. It's mind-boggling that at these churches we find people that there are some thinking people at these churches. So we're looking for those few people. And one funny anecdote, there was an event in 2012 in Washington. It was called Occupy APEC. It was sponsored by a number of groups, including Code Pink.
I think I remember that.
Yeah. And
I actually ran into Medea Dudgeman in Iran, I think, like a year after that. So, I remember that.
Yeah. Well, she was there. Yeah. No, it was great. And so we were there. We had a booth, and it was just fantastic to see all the. There were 250 people there, and then we did vigils in front of the convention center. Actually, the venue was at a Methodist church just almost across the street. But as a part of our effort, Chuck Carlson had picked a big mega church run. Actually, the senior pastor was a Messianic Jewish guy. He was a Jewish guy that became a Christian. Anyway, it was a Christian Zionist church, very large. They had 5 campuses, and it was out in McLean, and they had different branches. And we were joined by some of our local Muslim friends there. That's the amazing thing, is that we've done working with our Muslim friends to try to expose our Christians to this heresy. Well, another occasion on Al-Quds Day, Chuck Carlson was invited out to Washington, D.C. area to talk, and anyway, they did another vigil.
And let's remind the listeners what Quds Day is. It was started by Ayatollah Khomeini and out of Iran to remind Muslims of their duty to stand with the Palestinians, and then to invite others, not just Muslims, but to invite everybody to stand with the Palestinians.
Thank you for. You're right. That's an important thing. But anyway, 2 guys come out to talk with Chuck, and there was actually only 2. You only need 1 person to do vigils, and I've done a few one-man vigils. They know you're there with your signs and so forth. Anyway, so these 2 guys, they're military guys, and one of the signs that they were carrying was Chuck, and was "Who would Jesus bomb?" And I don't know which branch of the military they were in, but one of the guys had tattoos on all over him, and he saw that sign, and it just resonated with him, and he said, "I'm going to get a tattoo." So through LinkedIn, some couple years later, we finally connect up with him, and we've got a picture on our website. He's got a picture of a bomb on his forearm, Matthew 5:9, which is, "Bless the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." And so that's a constant reminder to people. And so you never know how we influence people with these activities. It's a meager at best, but they know we're out there. And one of the things that Chuck did was we always would send a letter to the pastor and the staff, letting them know that we're coming and why we're going to be there, why we think they should cancel. Most of these events were Christians United for Israel, let's make Israel feel wonderful events, Night to Honor Israel, and they had different venues. And so it's fascinating. What has happened now, there's groups like FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America. Sabeel is a Palestinian group of Christians, a variety of Orthodox and regular Christians, mainline, what have you, calling for justice. They published the Kairos document a number of years ago. But this FOSNA has, at least in 2019, when there was still a live event with Kufi's Christians United for Israel event, and of course they brought in all the big mega stars like Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo was the Secretary of State under Trump. And this kind of reminds me that one of the reasons people reject Christianity is when they see Christians like Mike Pompeo, who made a big deal that he was a Christian. And
I mean, how does that work? Mike, I've read the New Testament, and I've seen what the Quran says about Jesus, and I just don't see how somebody like Pompeo, with his taking huge bribes from this Iranian terrorist group, and being involved in encouraging the most brutal kinds of war crimes and killing, and very likely being a key guy behind the likely COVID bio attack on China and Iran that unleashed this pandemic thing that we're in. This guy he just oozes evil, and you can kind of see it in his face. I mean, how do Christians who are people following the teachings of Jesus, how do they reconcile that with somebody like Pompeo?
I ask that question all the time. I spent a month in my Savior's birthplace, Bethlehem, in August of 2017. And an interesting story there was quite remarkable. I had a lot of head knowledge about the subject, but came back with a lot of heart knowledge. It was through a Christian group, but we met with Muslims. We even met with, got the story from radical settlers, one in Hebron. And so we got the whole spectrum of what's going on there. But one was interesting. One of the gals that worked for the group they were with was from Brazil, and her father was a Christian. Turns out he was a Christian Zionist. And so on the last day that I was leaving, I got to have lunch with this gal. Her name was Danny, and a couple of other people. And she was telling me the day before she had called her father in Brazil and to wish him Father's Day. I guess it's in August in Brazil. But anyway, he was telling her, this was at the time that Donald Trump was saying we need to kill the leader of North Korea, this young, whatever his name is. And then, of course, he started talking and things changed. But there was a Christian Zionist pastor. His name is Robert Jeffress. He was one of Donald Trump's spiritual advisors. He gave the invocation at the dedication of the Jerusalem embassy for the United States back in 2018. Anyway, he came out publicly and said, we need to kill the leader of North Korea based on Romans 13. In other words, Romans 13 says that leaders were instituted by God and that you should follow these leaders. Well, there's a caveat to there. If it violates what God has told us to do, then you should not obey it. You may suffer the consequence because the state wields the sword. So the sword. I'll get that out.
That's kind of a thorny theological and philosophical question about following leaders. That in Islam we have some of that too. You know, to follow the leaders among you, the Ahlul Amr, and yet, you know, there's that debate about how bad leadership should you tolerate? At some level, you have to, you know, there's a cutoff point where you can't accept leadership that goes completely against all the moral teachings.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing that I wrestle with is, you know, Jesus told us to take the log out of our eye to see the speck in somebody else's eye. You know, we're blinded, and I can't judge these people, but I can certainly observe and challenge what they're doing. You know, they may change and they may repent later on. But what we need to challenge, you look what happened to Dietrich Bonhoeffer challenging Hitler during World War II, and he paid with his life. And yeah, it doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. You don't understand how somebody who claims to be a follower of Christ, love your neighbor as yourself, even love your enemy. And, you know, blessed are these peacemakers. It doesn't jive, but because a lot of people in churches are there because it's a comfortable thing, it's a social thing and what have you. So there's lots of reasons why they can go along with it. And, you know, guys like this Robert Jeffress calling for the killing of somebody, why wasn't there a big outcry of it? But people are so blinded. I guess, you know, we've been conditioned. There was a wonderful book in the 80s. You're so well read. You probably read it. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
Neil Postman. Yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah, isn't it? And he talks about entertainment. And, of course, religion, Christianity, I mean, through the TV, Now, at the time, there wasn't, when he wrote the book, there wasn't an internet, but, it is entertainment. And you see these big outfits. We have one of the things that we did early on, right after the Operation Cast Lead in 2009, we produced a little 4-minute video for YouTube, and it contained a segment of a vigil that Chuck Carlson was doing in Denver in front of a John Hagee event at a Christian Zionist church there. And with that I included a video of a prayer by John Hagee and a guy named Benny Hinn. He's a faith healer. And it was called This Is Your Day program. So Benny asked him at the half-hour program to give a prayer. Well, he prays to go to war. This is before the second Gulf War in 2003, a month or something before. And it's all about protecting Israel. Well, we got like 25,000 views in 2 or 3 weeks. And then it was cut off because John Hagee Ministries claimed they had the copyright. Well, the copyright was held by Benny Hinn, so there's no honor among thieves, I guess. But challenging these people needs to be done. We've actually conducted a vigil in front of John Hagee's church. His mega church has got 20,000 people in San Antonio. So, but we're seeing more people like this that I mentioned earlier, this Friends of Sabeel North America. And there's a Jewish group called If Not Now. These are activists, leftists, I guess, and it's out in New York, and they had a branch in San Francisco area. So they got them around the country. But they're starting to challenge. And in fact, one of the churches that a friend of ours out in the Bay Area had done a couple vigils was in Modesto, and they were hosting these Christians Unite for Israel event. Well, it turns out this If Not Now actually went there. We stand out on the sidewalks in public access areas. Well, anyway, this If Not Now group actually went inside and opened up banners and disrupted the thing. We don't recommend that, but they also at another.
Well, I guess they've got chutzpah.
Yeah, they've got chutzpah, exactly. And we said, hey, go for it, And so, this has not become a mass type of event, but it needs to be done on a big scale. For example, at my home church here in Scottsdale, one of the gals that's I've known, my wife has known for years, and her ministry is definitely decidedly Christian Zionist. They brag that they're Christian Zionist and what have you. But anyway, she convinced the senior pastor to have they called it a 911 remembrance, and they invited a guy named Waleed Shubat. His father.
Oh yeah, I had him on the show once. I had a very contentious conversation with him.
I can imagine you would, because he's a con man.
No, he's a phony. He claims he was from he's PLO. He's a Palestinian terrorist. He's a reformed Palestinian terrorist, and the whole thing is pure BS. It's all. It's like the Israeli equivalent of the Hill and Knowlton public relations firm that, gave us the Iraqi incubator babies. Well, they gave us the reformed terrorist, Waleed Shubat, to tell us how evil the Palestinians are, how they deserve to be exterminated.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing, Kevin. Chuck had done some research, and in the Jerusalem Post, by the way, folks, that's a Jewish publication, they had researched this. He claimed that they had blown up a bank, and the bank had no record of being attacked or any explosions.
No record of being blown up. Well, they must have lost the record.
Yeah, so you would think they might notice if he blew it up. But anyway, he went back to the U.S. with his mother, wife, his father. They divorced at the age of 16, so he couldn't have done too much damage. But a couple of years later, Anderson Cooper exposed him. He was at some anti-terrorist conference in South Dakota and was paid by one of the Health and Human Services or whatever alphabet soup agencies, something like $5,000. And he did a good sequence of exposing this man as a con man. But, he is taken in. And so on that particular day, we urged our pastor to cancel this event. Well, they didn't. And they had maybe 600-700 people. We stood out in 105-degree weather on the last day of Ramadan. We had two of our dear Muslim friends. It makes me weep to think about it, that stood with us in unity. And so it's been easier for us to speak to Muslims. And I would recommend anybody that goes to our website, be sure to watch our documentary, Christian Zionism, Tragedy and the Turning. And we're quite proud of this. We won an award at the Amar Popular Film Festival in Tehran in 2014.
Did you get to actually visit Tehran for that film festival?
No. Chuck was hoping to go there. It was done through a filmmaker that promoted it for us. We had to fill things out, and so no. Chuck would have loved to gone. If we'd gotten the invite, we would have gone. And but that was just unfortunate. So it's an honor that we wear. But in this documentary, it's 29 minutes. Chuck talks about the Scofield Reference Bible. Christian Zionism is a promoted religion. It was promoted actually by Cyrus Scofield, who had connections to Zionists. Actually, it was published by the Scofield Reference Bible, which is it was a King James version with his notes. It was published in 1909 by Oxford Press. Oxford Press had never published an American author or a religious book until then.
And this guy Scofield had no qualifications. He was just some kind of con man, snake oil salesman.
Yeah. He cheated his mother-in-law. He deserted his wife and 3 children. Yeah, he was not a very reputable person.
But didn't like a Rothschild syndicate banker end up financing him?
Yeah, there was a guy named Untermeyer, Samuel Untermeyer, who was a Zionist Jewish lawyer. He belonged to a very elite club called the Lotus Club that Scofield was invited into. And Scofield spent 4 years in Switzerland writing these notes. So there's a lot of interesting things about that. But I would urge listeners to go to our website, WHTT.org, listen to this Christian Zionism, Tragedy and Turning. And now a lot of the discussion there, this is a really interesting point. If you look closely at the credits, Chuck Carlson is delivering this explanation on Christian Zionism at a mosque in Detroit. And, we've been able to speak more at mosques to educate our fellow Muslims and Americans and so forth about the dangers of this heresy. And I also, if you look at our site too, I gave a talk here on the day of Al-Quds a number of years ago, and I updated it, explaining Christian Zionism to people, to Muslims, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, about this. Just as Christians want to lump all Muslims into ISIS and, that type of thing, it's crazy. And anyway, we...
actually, Tom, that Sheikh Imran Hossein has made a really interesting point that the Quran does say that among the closest in love and affection to Muslims will be those who say that they're Christian, because that they have monks and holy men and they're not arrogant. And then there's another passage though that says, don't take the Jews and Christians as your friends and allies, or friends/allies. And how do you reconcile that? Well, Sheikh Imran Hussein says that when the Quran tells us not to take the Jews and Christians as our friends and allies, that's Jews and Christians within brackets. That means the Christian Zionists, the Judeo-Christians, those who have joined together under Zionism. So he sees that as a warning about the coming of Zionism. And so that would actually make good sense, that the best friends of the Muslims would be real Christians, but we would have to be warned against the Christian Zionists.
Well, that's exactly right. This has been over 10 years ago. I got an email. It was probably 12 years ago. It must have been 2009. I got an email from one of my fellow Christians about this religious event in Missouri at a prison. And they invited all these religious leaders, Catholic priest, and I think there was a rabbi and a imam. And anyway, this guy that was a Christian that had some ministry supposedly badgered the imam and got the imam to say that, isn't it true that if you can't get somebody that can convert to Islam, you got to kill them? And, when I read this thing, I think, oh my gosh, if that were true, how would you get any converts if you had to kill them all?
Yeah.
Anyway,
I can't believe that kind of stuff. These bizarre hate legends about Muslims that you hear. It's completely insane.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing. Anyway, I did some research on it, and the guy that was with this ministry had backed off, but it was still floating around. It had been on the internet for 5 years or something like that. So, I said, I'm not going to defend Islam. So I reached out to some of my Islamic friends, including Imam, and they wrote responses. And it turns out this quote unquote Imam was one of the prisoners that said he was a Muslim. So, he wasn't even really an Imam, so that's the kind of thing. But I was on a list of a Zionist Jew. I think he's passed away, but I would say 5 years after I received that email, 5 or 6 years later, I get the same email from this Zionist Jewish guy, and it says, pass this on before Sharia law comes into existence. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's one of the things about the internet. My title of the article is "The Internet Never Lies, but People Do. Why Some Christians Love to Hate Muslims." And that's one of the features, is that, this stuff persists there. And so people need to check things. And of course, we know a lot of these fact checkers, when particularly with the scamdemic that's going on now, they're all kind of inside fact checkers and getting paid by the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to corroborate their alleged fact checking and so forth. So it's quite interesting, all this stuff. It's all very fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, though, that there's, the fact checking around some of these issues of Zionism and so on is so terrible that, it's obviously the so-called, the people that get called names, the people that get called anti-Semites for standing very strongly against the crimes of Zionism, that get put down and shot down by the mainstream propagandists. But when you actually get into the facts, it's kind of shocking how evil so many of these crimes of the Zionists have been. Just, when you start exploring the background of the history where Zionism comes from, with Laurent Guyonneau's book From Yahweh to Zion, and then you get into the 20th century with the world wars, the bankster cabal, the political assassinations, including the Kennedys, and 9/11, among other events. And I guess the USS Liberty could be thrown in there too, where the world was almost destroyed in that one. These over-the-top crimes quite often are tied in with these Zionist extremists. That there's an evil that seems to be embedded in Zionism, and if you look theologically, it's so obvious where that would be. Like this is, I don't understand why Christians could ever fall for this, because where does Zionism come from? It comes from the false Messiah, Shabtai Zvi, who declared himself the Son of God, and the Jewish Messiah said it's time to be Zionists and go back to the Holy Land and take it over for Jews, and we Jews will defeat all of the Goyim and rule the world from Jerusalem. And here he's calling on this ancient Jewish messianic trope. And so that sets the stage that this self-appointed false Messiah, who was a Satanist, by the way, and whose career peaked in the year 1666, set the stage for Zionism, which is coming out of a religion that hates Jesus. The Muslims love Jesus, Christians love Jesus, and the Jewish religion has no use for Jesus. And then the Zionist extremist version of it and the extreme tribalist version of Judaism really hates Jesus. And the satanic Zionist side of it is, hates Jesus with a satanic passion. So that's what these people are worshiping when they worship Israel. It's, I think they're really going to have their eyes opened when they face judgment.
Well, if they went on a tour like I did, where you actually, we even got to spend 4 nights with a Palestinian Christian family there in Bethlehem. But one of the concepts that was given to me there, we went and worshiped at a couple little evangelical churches, was the concept of living stones and dead stones. Most of the tourists that go there, Christian tourists, only get to visit the dead stones. And what do I mean by that? For example, in Bethlehem, you have the Church of the Nativity over the site where Jesus was supposedly born. We don't know that. And, so they go there. They have to go through the checkpoint. They're literally walling in Bethlehem. There's a wonderful movie, Open Bethlehem, about this process of walling in. So they got to go through a checkpoint. They change the guide to an Arab. They go see the holy site, and then they leave. Maybe stop for tourists. But they don't get to interact with any of the living stones, the Palestinian Christians. And in Israel, Christians are less than 2%. It's like 1.5%. And the big majority of those Christians are Muslims. The Messianic Jews, yes, they're there, but they're a very, very tiny portion of that. I don't know, something maybe less than 50.
Wait. When you say that the Christians there are Muslims, how do you mean that?
I'm sorry, are Arabs.
Arabs. Arab Christians. Yeah. I mean, it's true that we Muslims are followers of Jesus, who's one of the very highest and certainly the holiest of the prophets. Yeah.
Well, that's right. And I'm a stickler. I always operate under the facts. If I just give people the facts, they're going to believe me. Well, that doesn't work that way. I'm 75 years old, and it's taken me a long time to figure a lot of this stuff out. So, God's going to reveal to us what he wants to reveal to us. And all we can do is challenge people and ask questions and, have the dialogue. So that's what I love about your program, is that, you really have I don't know how you get all these things. And thank you for quick response, inviting me on. This is just amazing that, we can tell our little story. There are more Christians.
These are great stories, Tom. And I love the work you've been doing.
Yeah. Well, in 2017, we did a vigil in front of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, this makes me...
And Tom, we have about a minute, 30 seconds left here. So
okay. Well, let me just finish this story. Anyway, they had their annual meeting there, and the new leader of the Religious Liberty and Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is a guy named Russell Moore. He preached at the very same church we did our first vigil. I went to that church. I introduced myself. I gave my video to him. I gave the 2 flyers that we handed out to him and I asked him, do you believe in divine providence? And he said, oh, yes. I said, we were here 14 and a half years ago because of the land letter. I didn't have to explain to him what the land letter was, because he had gotten a lot of flack from Southern Baptists because he was challenging the idea of worshiping Donald Trump in 2016. And we saw that. Anyway.
Yeah, and I do appreciate how guys like you, Tom, and Chuck Carlson and Chuck Baldwin. Funny how these two, great exposure to Christian Zionists are both Chucks. Yeah.
yeah. And Chuck did a 180. Chuck Baldwin did a 180, and he was a protege of.
He's great. So hey, there's still some hope. There's some wonderful Christians out there. Thank you so much, Tom. Great talking. God bless.
Thank you. Glad to.
Tom.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio.
Be evasive. But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
And Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, and there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, indicating that there were giants before the Nephilim.
And sons of God, plural. They weren't talking about Jesus coming down.
No, that's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Steve Crawford, host of Factor Theory Live. Join me every Sunday night from 10 p.m. till midnight Eastern Standard Time on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Check it out.
I am Bill Johnson. Some consider my efforts to be an underground law school. I am not an attorney, and I do not give legal advice. I teach. That's lawful and legal. Consider yourself served. You are to appear Wednesday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern, Studio A. My forte? Foreclosure and contract law. Grab your legal pad and pen. Learn a broad spectrum of law spanning administrative, criminal, family, tort, and federal law. Fools and losers cling to old cases. I dissect and comment on the latest rulings that control the courts. Don't be a loser. And if you don't appear, you will be held in contempt.
Transcending time and space, let us take you to the place inside your mind where thoughts divide and mysteries unwind. Join us every Monday evening right here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and you will catch